Good morning, everyone. I'm Michael Lawrence. I'm the Chief Executive at Asia House. Welcome, and welcome to this morning's event, which we're exploring McKinsey's Delivering Through Diversity report. We're delighted to be joined by Dame Vivian Hunt, Managing Director at McKinsey & Company, UK and Ireland, who will shortly brief us on some of the key findings of the study with a specific focus on the Asia-Pacific region. McKinsey's Delivering Through Diversity follows its influential Why Diversity Matters study of 2015, and it highlights the link between a more diverse workforce and company financial performance. According to this latest report, which is based on more than 1,000 companies covering 12 countries, the business case for diversity continues to be compelling and have global relevance. The report finds that there is a statistically significant correlation between a more diverse leadership team and financial outperformance. The report also includes 17 case studies, a more granular look at companies from major regions and multiple industries who have successfully harnessed inclusion and diversity to meet their growth objectives. Now, in a moment, I'll invite Vivian Hunt to brief us on the report's findings, specifically regarding the Asia-Pacific region, and after which she'll join me on stage for a Q&A session, and she'll be delighted to take questions from you as well. A little later, we'll broaden the discussion with a panel looking at some experiences from leading organisations including BHP, Hitachi, Linklaters, and the University of Nottingham. And we'll conclude the session with a speech by Priscilla To, Director General of the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office in London, who will brief us on Hong Kong's policy on diversity and social inclusion. But first, it's my great pleasure to welcome to the stage Vivian Hunt.
Thank you very much, Michael, and to all our colleagues and collaborators at Asia House. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope that we don't have to do knowledge as foundational and distinctive as this to get invited back again, but it is really important, and you'll see in the coming days as we continue to navigate the mid-sized issue that is Brexit, to the bigger challenge, which is about productivity growth. And if you really want to grow and grow underlying productivity, you have to participate in growth in Asia. And so it's our pleasure to be here and to try and bring a little bit more granularity, fact base, and hopefully confidence to act for both companies and government on this topic in Asia. Michael is right that this builds on a very long tradition that McKinsey has of doing work around the economic role of women and now other diverse profiles in the economy. It started in 2007 with a European piece of work called Women Matter, and it now has extended literally to 95 countries around the world. If I told you we expected the work to be as substantial and relevant as it is today when we started, I can't say that would be true. But what we do know is that the economic participation argument, taking the business why and rationale off the table, the if this makes a difference, with a fact-based argument that's relevant in local geographies and industries, we hope is a powerful contribution to economic development and growth, both in developed as well as fast growth economies. So when we look at the outcomes of the work, what we find is two things. One is globally, we're trying to look at, we use the phrase equality, we use the phrase parity, but basically, women and men participating in the economy at the same rate. If you looked at the value of equality in the economy, what would it be worth? And across 95 countries, that turned out to be a pretty big number. 28 trillion, which is the value of women participating by sector, by function, by geography, at the same rate as men. Women don't want 51%, but they don't want 49. They just want, let's say, proportional to their representation in the workforce. And that produces a pretty big opportunity because whilst places like the UK or the US have 40% or 45% women's participation in the economy, many geographies in Asia are far, far below that. So it's just a net opportunity for growth, more household incomes, and more income, frankly, to the middle and lower middle classes, lifting people out of poverty. That said, everyone getting to the same level is really unrealistic. And when you simply say, how much would it be worth if we were able to do the same as the best country or industry in our region? So let's compare like with like. That number then adjusts to the 12 trillion number that some of you will have heard before. It's about 11% of global GDP, so still pretty substantial, but we believe a realistic target by 2025, 2030, by country and by sector. When you break it down, it actually is achievable. And a 5% or a 10% increase in a profit pool, a demand pool, participation in the economy over a 5 to 6, 8-year period is a realistic objective if, as a management team or a government, you really set your mind to it. So that 11% increase in global GDP is a best-in-region number. It's made up of three drivers. One is participation. 60% of the benefit worldwide is from women's increased participation in the workforce. These are women who have said that they want to work, have some relevant skills, but are underrepresented in the workforce. So this isn't about taking engineers that don't exist, or women who don't want to work, or people who don't have access to the requirements for working. This is women who want to work more in the workforce. In the UK, that number is about 30%, because there are already more women in the workforce. But if you look at markets like Indonesia or Malaysia or China, rural India versus urban India, you'll know that there are many women who are outside the workforce. Some of them for reasons of their own choosing, but many of them for reasons of social expectations, as well as employers not being sensitive to recruiting even amounts of men and women, for example. So the global opportunity, because the majority of the world, of course, is still in faster growth, developing economies, participation, just simply more women at work, is still a major, major driver. The second area is about shifting the balance towards more full-time work. Many people are underemployed, or they work a little bit less than they'd like to. And most families, most households, if you think about poverty-level incomes, middle-class incomes in Asia, would like more income at the household level. Most people would like to work a little bit more. They're just not willing to trade off childcare. They're not willing to trade off social criticism from their family and network. They're not willing to commute twice as far to be able to do that. So some parameters will have to change to be able to work a little bit more, but working full-time and fully participating, even once you have a job, is itself 20% of the opportunity. And then the last piece is about sector mix and productivity, and this is about more women in leadership roles and more women in higher productive, fast growth sectors, principally technology. Now those can be relatively entry-level jobs in technology, so cloud service and maintenance, for example, data cleaning, for example. So not necessarily the building of the robot, but component manufacturer, which isn't that different than component manufacturer for, say, a Hoover or a vacuum cleaner. You just put the component into a robot instead of into a Hoover. Women can do lots and lots of those types of jobs. Complex, high skill, but higher skill than they would be doing for the normal rural, agricultural, domestic work for which they're often not paid. So that's the mix predominantly if you look across the globe. It varies quite significantly country to country. These numbers in the UK would be about 30, 30, 30, right? So when you look at the global figures, participation is a bigger deal. And in Asia, as you'll see later, workforce participation in high-value sectors is the so what for a market like Indonesia, Malaysia, or particularly rural parts of China or India. In Asia, accounts for about 4.5 trillion of the 12 trillion that I mentioned earlier. It's about 12% of GDP across the region. Just to put that into quantum for you, that's the same as adding a Germany or an Austria every year. And 60% of that, as I say, is from workforce participation. So the good news about this is it's actually easy to get at. The women are there. Many of them have the skills or the skill base on which to build to participate, and the economy, frankly, often demand-led and in power mode, needs more talent, needs more capability. Most economies in Asia literally can't grow without more women's participation in the workforce. And if you think about culture, language, etc., you need women from your own country, from your own culture, to participate and grow, to really make the supply chains and the network work. Looking across the region in a little bit more detail, every country can achieve more than 5% an incremental GDP from that area, and it varies obviously depending on which geography that you're in. The highest being I never understand how these colors work, but the highest being the dark blue, so in India with the most incremental opportunity given the relatively low workforce participation in rural areas, and the huge number of secondary and tertiary cities that will be at scale. The same is obviously true for a market like China or Brazil or Mexico, for example. You then have the orange, which are simply larger economies, already pretty developed with multiple tiers in terms of sector productivity, but have very high incremental growth. And 10 to 15% growth is very material, and that's in the second range. And then finally, the markets that are a little bit slower growth, like a Japan, like a South Korea, that still are looking at 5 to 9% growth, which is 5x or 9x the expected, let me say 5 to 8x the expected UK growth rate, for example. So when you compare it to a developed economy, it is a level of growth that we won't see and participate in. And so if we want the entire global economy to grow or to participate in relative growth, you really need to participate in this. And you can't actually achieve that growth without more gender participation and parity. But the quantum of opportunity, the levers that you will use, and how you tailor it to each geography is very, very different within Asia, all of which is worth going after, needed and worth going after. And so we move to how. The first thing we do is we try and help each country, but we can also do this by sector within country and sector globally, of course, is try and understand how much relative progress does a country or a company need to make. And it's important that you can do this at a country, sector, and company level, because many of you who work for different companies that have participation in Asia, it's interesting to know the general numbers, but you want to know what can Hitachi do, or what can McKinsey do, or what could BHP Billiton do. How can we make it specific so that we can action it? Because the other point Michael framed is that it drives competitive advantage. Some companies are doing this well, some countries are doing this well, but others aren't. And so which levers, which areas are the ones that you have to most focus on? And we would say 4. The first is about women's equality and role at work. There is a lot that companies and or ministries as employers can do within the factors that impact women's ability and participation at work. Equality in work, which ranges from everything from hiring, promotion rates, compensation rates, and flexibility of work programs, equality of parenting rights, equal grievance rights, transparency, things that are frankly good for any employee, but particularly helpful to women, are the biggest factor. The second relate to equality in society, and this is one of the first reports that McKinsey's done where we've actually commented explicitly on social or policy levers that are important, because it would be naive to think that the presence of essential services, for example, and obviously access to digital services or financial services products, don't disproportionately bias women out of their economic participation. Similarly, legal protection and political voice, they're the area of the world that has the lowest gender parity score in the Middle East, followed by Southeast Asia, have some major restrictions on where and how women work, political voice and representation. We know that female economists actually support and vote for, develop different policies. They simply research different areas than male economists. The same is true for legislators, and that's why representation in parliament and decision-making bodies does matter. And then finally, physical security and autonomy. Many women are still excluded from work by choice and also through family and cultural mores. Those are just facts of their experience, but it means they may not go out of the home or leave their village or participate in school past a certain point. I spent 2.5, almost 3 years in the Peace Corps, one of the early part of my career working as a midwife, and it was very clear that when girls got to the age of 6 or 7 or 8, when they could be useful around the house, useful in the fields, they went to school at a significantly lower rate than the boys did. That's not unique to rural Senegal, and certainly is an issue here. So that's an example of the social norms. Violence and physical security is also an issue. Even within the UK, 1 out of 3 women have experienced violence in a domestic relationship, whether that's verbal, mental, or physical abuse. And those rates are higher in some parts of the world, and certainly in some parts of Southeast Asia. So if you don't feel physically safe and secure, and you're not in a domestic situation that is supportive of you working, even though your household might clearly need the income, that probably is the first thing to fix. We can worry about educational participation, we can worry about what you're doing at work, but getting out the door and to work safely or to school safely is often job one. And so what we found is that mix of characteristics, there are 15 by country, varies for different countries. And so what you might do first is different. And it's also one of the reasons, again, to take a UK example, that I think the UK is concentrated on transparency, for example, on gender pay statistics, and also with ethnic and cultural minorities, because they believe that companies will act if they have more transparency and comparison without necessarily legislative intervention. Because legal status, transparency, political weight, and voice matter and move companies to action. Similarly here, there are some geographies where some changes in political voice, physical security, for example, safety for women, are required for women to be able to participate in the workforce. And we don't want to shy away from that, because for this to be relevant for Asia, for those women to really work and lift their households and families out of poverty through the middle class and participate in the extraordinary growth as Asia returns to its balanced place in the economy, China and the broader region, those things need to change just as much as the elements at work. In terms of common themes across the region, there really are 4. First is recognizing that the disparity is very significant. Women are 50% of the economy, but only 37% of labor force participation. It doesn't take much to do that, be able to do that math. Secondly, leadership positions. Only 1 in 5 leadership positions are held by women at the manager level or above. And what we know is decision-making, diversity of decision-making, is what's most strongly correlated with performance. Remember, the statistics Michael quoted earlier are about companies who perform well, and then we observe what is common about them. And one of the things they all do is have more gender participation, as well as other forms of cultural, ethnic, and cognitive diversity than other teams. But it means that you need more diverse profiles in leadership, and that's one area where women are behind. So even when you see some industries in Asia where you have higher participation of women, it typically is at not in decision-making or managerial roles. Third is access to digital technologies and platforms. I think we're done building sort of analog businesses, and Asia's acceleration will be disproportionately successful if it also continues to build and leapfrog analog platforms. And you see that with the large digital players, and also how many of these economies are thinking about digitizing, say, public services, just skipping the whole land or analog phase. But with 1.1 billion people now unconnected in low and middle income households, we have lots and lots of individual stories or niche stories, or let me say project or prototype stories. What you need to do is scale that to a national level. And then finally, of course, the entrenched attitudes about women's role in society. We have to be very careful not to be critical here. You know, we all live in a world of social norms and cultures. We don't argue that the social norms and cultures of one country are better than another. We all need to have boundaries around human rights and social inclusion. But at the same time, we also have to recognize that many women and some men, some ethnic groups, etc., face those biases. So if people believe that you're not a good mother, right, and there are some cultures where there's specific words for the criticism of a woman who leaves her family to work, I think in German as well as in many Asian cultures as well, that subtle pressure does impact women's attitudes, and it impacts husbands' attitudes and families' attitudes. And so having it be normative that you can participate and contribute to your family, be a good mother by working outside the home as much as inside the home, have networks of support, etc., is an important part of the change, because the social and cultural pressures we know will dominate very often. If my husband or my mother my children are disapproving of something that I'm doing that weighs on my decision factors. And so we want to be realistic about that and not assume that every woman's just a superwoman, you know, that old thing where you just put your hands on your hips and pretend it's okay. You can't just put your hands on your hip and pretend it's okay. You actually have to work at changing and normalizing social norms, which is why it's so important that governments and whole sectors, you know, every employer in a sector, in a region, participate in these initiatives so it becomes more normative. Because if it's normative, women will feel supported doing it, and that'll help the economy grow. As ever, being McKinsey, there's going to be a couple of charts that hurt the eyes a little bit, and we are very happy at another time to talk about the pipelines by country, as well as to talk about the pipelines by industry. But just to give you an example of some of the granularity that this study, which is really very exciting, it's the first study of this level of granularity that we've done. We've offered the data to the UN development goals. I don't know which one it is, but gender equality is one of the 14. And it's very important that it's granular and specific because the blockages, the bottlenecks, you'd say, in business language, are at different points depending on the country. So if you look at a Japan or an India, getting women into education, tertiary level education in the right degrees, particularly for higher skilled, higher pay work, is a particular problem. It's surprising because Japan has an excellent and very broad and uniform education system, yet women's participation in it at the higher level degrees is the same as India's. Once you have those graduates moving to the middle of the chart, what you see in a place like India is that you see an issue with women who have the education but don't ever enter the workforce. If you look at that 25% at entry-level positions and compare it to the 50% in China or the 49% in Japan, it means women have the degrees, even at tertiary level, which is already quite an advanced and elite educational level, simply not going into work and growing their economic base from there. It's a particularly sharp anomaly in India, but therefore you do something different that you might do in China. I'm not saying 50% is good enough. Please don't misunderstand me. It's just simply saying focusing on the biggest bottlenecks where a government or a company can make a big difference and quick progress is often motivating for leaders and managers who haven't taken these steps in the past. Moving across and through the leadership pyramid, you see in middle management is a particularly acute issue in China. Women leaving the workforce a little bit later, often for family and or life stage reasons. But whether or not you end up with children, whether or not you have 1 child or 10 children, you see women leaving the workforce at a very high rate. Similarly, Japan has the sharpest fall off, with 50% of entry-level positions occupied by women, but only 9% of middle management positions. And middle management is defined pretty generously here. So think of yourself as a team leader. So you've been working in an entry-level job for 5 or 10 years and you become a team leader. Oftentimes that qualifies as middle management in many economies. And so this notion of the mindset of can a woman lead a team, is a woman an appropriate and effective leader of a team, clearly varies. And then through senior management, which is CEO and CEO -1, and board membership, where again there's variability, but broadly speaking, it's all too low. And so to solve it, you've got to get granular. And I know you say, oh, McKinsey, you would say that. But if you really think about 2 different companies, 2 different industries, 2 different countries, even though the trend is the same, more participation from women would grow the economy, the solutions are very different. Urban to rural, geography to geography, and industry by industry. And we really want to encourage those who want the maximum economic development in envelope and the maximum elevation for these countries from poverty and for men and women to understand that we've got to be more granular in terms of how we fix it. And hopefully this will give some of the evidence and the tools that countries, industries, and companies can use to really achieve parity and fix some of the disparities that this chart suggests. And I'm very happy to take questions about specific countries and or specific industries when we're in our informal Q&A. So I'll leave you with a few thoughts for getting started on what you now do about it. One is recognize that there has been progress in some significant areas in Asia. Maternal mortality has advanced significantly and improved. Places like Bangladesh, Cambodia, India, Nepal have had massive increases simply in women and girls and overall child longevity, but most importantly, the mothers also fare a little bit better in maternal-child health. Education, moving and leveling up the progress of women and participation later in the workforce, and of course labor force participation in places like Malaysia or urban China have increased significantly. We know it's correlated strongly with performance. I won't repeat the data that Michael used earlier in terms of the strong correlation with gender as well as cultural and ethnic diversity in leadership teams. The only point I'd stress is that it needs to be in leadership, not just presence in the workforce. Both are important, but leadership is what's correlated with performance. And that the pipeline in every country, as we saw earlier when we were looking at job promotion, and now we're looking at women in leadership, is very, very thin. And so we really want to be not alarmist with these numbers, but to use them to help motivate companies and motivate employers, including the public sector, to be more confident and bold in their appointments. We know it results in better performance, and we know there are significant gaps in their participation. And we will make these charts as well as the data available to Asia House if you want to follow up on any one country or after. But the important point is about leadership and decision making and different debate around the table. We have BHP with us in the room, and they'll talk about some of the terrific initiatives that they've done. But there are many companies that are making progress. No one is perfect. You know, companies are a little bit like people. We do our best. But many companies are making progress by driving to specifics and linking it to their business initiative. Westpac met its target of 50%. That's parity. In leadership, having grown from an initial ambition of 40%. When they started, I think they probably didn't have any idea how they would get there, and I'm sure BHP will talk about that today and some of the very public and bold commitments it's made. I don't know that you knew how you were going to get to some of their numbers, but what you can see, and Westpac just is one example here, they made significant progress there, using data, using tailored action plans, and adjusting it to local context. Wipro, another example, where they had a lot of senior commitment, but then linked that to their customer insight. Oftentimes you have to pick an area. You can't work on all of them at once. In the case of Westpac, they focused very much on inclusion and diversity metrics for recruitment and retention. Wipro also focused on its customer base. A private equity client that we have is focusing very much on its portfolio. It doesn't believe it's going to have more diverse investment managers soon. It takes a long time to build a world-class investment manager. And they only have 100 or 200 of them. And they don't yet have the normative culture where they've been able to figure out how to get senior female investment managers to stay. But what they did decide to do was concentrate on their portfolios, where they impact billions of pounds of investment right across the world and can use metrics and scorecards. Similarly, a company like Bloomberg is using environmental as well as gender data that it can put on every investment screen in the world as one of its way to move the needle as they try and move the needle within Bloomberg. So I highlight this for Wipro because what they decided to do was use their customer base as a motivation for their employee base. As opposed to just starting with beating the company up and beating its chest internally, they said actually if we can move with our customers and our supply chain, that might just motivate our employees. And you see many companies like BAE, UPS, Walmart doing that, including for a company like Walmart with its Asian operation. And so in conclusion, I'd leave you with 5 thoughts. One is it's a big opportunity for Asia. 4.5 trillion is nearly half of the global opportunity, and that reflects the continued return, we would say at McKinsey, of Asia to its appropriate weighting, and the combination of China returning to its historical prominence plus Southeast Asia motoring with India, Japan, and Australia really means that the next century or two will be one where Asia will be quite prominent. So we're not surprised that Asia is almost half the opportunity. 2 is that 5% of economic growth lifts many people out of poverty, builds many terrific businesses, and changes the game in many of these Asian markets, and that's well worth doing. Over half of the Asian countries we studied, it's an over 10% GDP gain. There literally is nothing else you could do that would add as much to the economy. Third, there has been a lot of progress in very important areas, but it's still many areas where there is significant inequality, some of which are at work, some of which are in society. 4 issues, if you had to focus and choose, Where to start? Labor force participation, business leadership and leadership appointments, digital technology and platforms, and working on societal attitudes and norms tailored to each geography. And then finally, it's not something that business can do entirely on its own, and I think there are some good examples we can talk about where governments have tried to both change laws as well as change the tone around women's participation and move the needle. It's not something where businesses have to do it alone, and indeed there are many great case examples, policies across countries, best practices across companies where companies can collaborate. You see examples where companies are training 100 women engineers or training a number of scholarships. They're all not going to come work at that company, or they're all not going to stay, but training more women for the workforce benefits everyone. So thank you so much for your time and attention this morning. I'm looking forward to our brief discussion and questions and then the panel thereafter. Thank you again.